Today we're going to do 2.6 and learn a little bit more about inflation, what causes inflation, and why some people are helped and others are hurt when inflation happens. So first of all, what is inflation? It's not the increase in the price of one good or two goods. It's the overall increase in the price level, as we said before, as measured by a price index. So why do we care about inflation? Well, for one thing, inflation adds to what we call transaction costs. In other words, it makes it a little bit more challenging for people to buy and sell things because they can't necessarily predict what the price is going to be, and they might need more money, for example, than they have on hand. Menu costs are also an issue. You think of some restaurants like Cheesecake Factory or maybe Green Mill that have these nice laminated menus, and whenever the prices change, the price of resources changes, they need to increase their price, they have to actually reprint and redo the menus. Now some places have chalkboards, or they have electronic pricing, so it's a little bit easier, but there are plenty of places that actually have to go through and print out new prices for everything, and that's a big opportunity cost. It's wasting their time. Unit of account cost means it becomes more difficult for people to know what a dollar means or what a dollar is worth. The different rates means the things you buy might get more expensive before your wages actually go up. So that can cause a problem where you're kind of caught where it looks like your wages are going up but your real income is actually going down. And then of course there's always the risk for hyperinflation. And hyperinflation is really bad. It can destroy an economy. We'll talk more about it later today, and there are two videos on the Moodle site which you should also watch about Zimbabwe and Zimbabwe's experience with hyperinflation. So what causes inflation? You can see the flames there. We'll talk about about hyperinflation in a minute. There's really two main causes. Supply side inflation and demand side inflation. And so supply side inflation, as you can see from the graph, and eventually we'll do this with the graph of the macroeconomy. We're just going to do it on a simplified supply and demand graph today. So it looks like it's referring to just one good, but I want you to remember that we are going to make this macro, and eventually this is going to refer to all goods. But when the price of resources goes up, right, when resources or factor prices go up, something like oil or water or steel, and in the 1970s it was oil. When the price of resources goes up, as we learned in Unit 1, supply shifts left and prices go up, and that's what we call a supply shock or cost push inflation. It's a supply shock because supply is what's shifting. It's cost push because it's the resource costs, right, that change it. And the biggest problem with this kind of inflation that happened in the 70s is that you don't just have inflation, but you also are going to end up with a decrease in output. Q is going to go down as well, and when we look at this on a macro scale, you're going to see that we have inflation and we have unemployment. And this actually has a term. When you have both inflation and unemployment, people refer to that as stagflation. The stag is supposed to come from stagnation, right, which is the recession aspect. So stagflation is when we have cost push or supply shock. On the other side, we can get inflation because of what we call demand side or demand pull inflation, and that means too many dollars chasing the same number of goods. And again, we'll see this on a macro scale later once we build the macro model, when we talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. But when people start spending more and there really isn't that much more to buy, that forces up prices. So if you think about a place like Seattle or San Francisco, there's only a limited stock of housing in the city. Housing's in great demand. People start going and bidding up the price of houses, and they experience pretty severe inflation because there's only so much to buy, and there's a lot of people who want to buy it. So it actually becomes kind of like an open auction. And you'll notice these flames are on the term inflationary expectations, and there's a reason for that. This term sounds like not a big deal, like, oh, maybe we might expect some inflation. But inflationary expectations is another word for hyperinflation. Okay, or another two words for hyperinflation, which is what you see in that Zimbabwe video. Okay, when people expect inflation, the problem is, and we talked about this again in Unit 1, that when people expect inflation, they expect housing prices to go up, they expect gas prices to go up. They go out and they spend their money now to protect themselves against that inflation. But when they do that, they're essentially causing demand pull inflation. And that demand pull inflation then feeds on itself, and people think, oh my gosh, prices did go up. Now they're going to go up even more. We should go spend more. And then they go up again. And they think, oh my gosh. And people keep spending and really running up the price. And So inflationary expectation is when that gets really out of control. When you see like 30% inflation in a year, then the next year it leaps to 80% or 100%. Again, if you watch the Zimbabwe video, you get a pretty good view of what inflationary expectations looks like. And while mild demand pull inflation doesn't necessarily lead to a recession or any other further economic problems, hyperinflation is so destabilizing that it really leads to a breakdown of the financial system and ends up resulting in widespread unemployment. So it can have pretty devastating consequences. Okay, so this is just a little graph to show you what U.S. inflation rates actually look like and what happened to the price level. So keep in mind that, inflation rates are on here pretty much positive, right? But they're varying a lot. I'm sorry, inflation rates are over here. So there's a little spot over here where, oh no, where inflation rates are actually negative, right? This little deflation period over here. But most of the time inflation rates are above zero, right? Because there's some inflation. When inflation rates are high, you see that the slope of the price level line goes up. And when inflation rates are declining, you see a smoothing out of that line, right? Because it's a rate of change. Okay, so up here in this one place where we actually had deflation, that's the only time when you see the price level, which is this left axis, when you see the price level actually going down. Disinflation happens anytime the inflation rate drops. We'll call that disinflation. But deflation only happens when inflation actually becomes negative. So when there's deflation, your price level is dropping. When there's disinflation, the rate of increase is falling. Okay, so with inflation, we think of it as a negative, and of course it is a negative for the economy, but it doesn't impact all people the same way. In fact, some people are actually helped by unanticipated inflation, or inflation they didn't really prepare for. Other people are severely hurt. And what it really comes down to is this issue of if you are paying or receiving a fixed payment. That's really what we're looking at, is if there's a fixed payment. So people who are paying some kind of fixed payment, okay, who owe money, those people are going to be helped by inflation. Okay, and I'll explain why in just a second. People who are receiving any kind of fixed payment, or people who, oops, I meant to write fixed, or people who are not owing money, but people who have lent money are going to be hurt. So why are people paying a fixed amount helped? Because if I, for example, have an apartment lease, I sign a lease and I'm going to agree to pay, say, $600 a year, when there is inflation, the inflation diminishes the value of that $600 a year. So in other words, I agreed to pay what we'll call dear dollars. I agreed to pay dear dollars. Dear just means they're precious or they're valuable. And I end up getting to repay in cheap dollars. Okay? So I agreed to pay a certain amount in rent, and then I'm like, hey, this is great because $600 now is, basically only worth what $300 was a year ago, so I'm getting a bargain. Also, if I owe money, if I borrow money, buy something on a credit card, and then we have inflation, again, I borrow dear dollars and I get to repay cheap dollars. So inflation is really helpful to people in that situation. So it can also help, like, for example, my parents bought a house in the 1970s, and they paid, I don't know what they paid for it, something like $60,000 for it, okay? And then we had lots of inflation. So their house, the price was $60,000 for it, and their payments were like $250 a month or something ridiculously low like that. And over the next, like, 2 decades, the value of the price grew, the price of the house grew to like $300,000 because of inflation, but the payment stayed the same, right? So they really benefited there. Their house grew in value. Their payments did not. Their payments actually, and they were paying in cheaper dollars. So they were winners on that end. Okay, so who gets hurt? Well, anybody who's receiving a fixed payment. So if I agree to, let you rent my apartment for $600 a year, I should have put a month. But let's say, if I agree to that, right? And then I'm the one receiving the payment. I lent dear dollars and I'm receiving cheap ones. So that's a bad deal for me. Also, lenders in general get caught in this, because you think about the people who lent my parents that money. They lent my parents $60,000 in really valuable dollars, and now they're getting repaid $250 a month in cheap dollars. So when you're answering questions about who gets helped and who gets hurt, you really have to think to yourself, where are they? What side are they on? Are they the ones who are paying, or are they the ones who are receiving? And if it's not a fixed amount, if the amount varies, so for example, if you have a variable payment like an adjustable rate mortgage, which is called an ARM, adjustable rate mortgage, then the rate changes with inflation. So it kind of protects the bank, and it could negatively impact the homeowner, because they will agree to a certain rate, and then when there's inflation, now they have to pay more, and their wages might not go up at the same rate. So the questions that you're going to do are a little bit tricky, and we will go over them. Some of them you might not know. For example, Social Security is on there. Somebody who's living on Social Security. So you have to ask yourself, is Social Security fixed, and are they paying or receiving? Well, they're receiving it, so if it's fixed, that's going to be bad for them. Social Security does actually have what's called cost of living adjustments. So they actually do get more money if they're receiving Social Security, but often it doesn't keep up with the price with the rate of inflation. So I want you to think through those examples and see where they fit, and just do the best you can with answering those questions. When it comes to inflation and interest rates, we're going to, again, just use a very simple subtraction. We're just going to say nominal interest rates are basically real interest rates plus a payment for inflation. So if you want to know what the real interest rate is, you take the nominal interest rate and you subtract the rate of inflation, right? And then you'll get the real interest rate. So 11 minus 6 equals 5. So we're going to do very simple adjustments to see what happens. But what this table is meant to show, or this graph is meant to show, is that in periods of high inflation, nominal interest rates go up a lot. Right? When there's high inflation, the lenders want to protect themselves, so they charge higher interest rates because they're anticipating inflation. And this is something we'll unpack a little bit more later in the course when we talk more about interest rates. Okay, last thing here is this free response question. I am going to have you answer that, so make sure you look at the notes, and you can bring your response to that with you to class tomorrow. And that is it for our introduction to who is helped and who is hurt by inflation.